Because what's scarier than a book written by a hack and a dead man? Very dramatic. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This is Afrodo Reviews, and welcome back to the channel, everyone. Here we decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? If I still had Mount Doom out here, I could totally point dramatically with the cane, but Mount Doom ain't doing too well, guys. Okay, come on. Nope. I cannot take your full weight in my lap. You are not a lapdog. Eruption by Michael Crichton and James Patterson was published on June 3rd of 2024 and was written by Patterson off of one of Michael Crichton's old manuscripts. For those of you who aren't aware of the name, Michael Crichton is a very prolific author who has penned some of the most well-known books and thus subsequently led to some of the most well-known adaptations of his work. You might know him from such works as Jurassic Park, The Andromeda Strain, Westworld, and many other well-known classics. If you do know all this, you probably also know that tragically, Michael Crichton died in the year of 2008 due to laryngeal cancer, which means this book was written almost 16 years after the man's death. Now, publishing posthumous works isn't exactly out of the ordinary for Crichton or even the publishing industry in general. See William J. Johnstone and the trigger warning controversy, where William J. Johnstone has been dead for quite a few years and yet seems to be publishing at a very interesting rate, to the point that people are quite sure that his son is using his name for... In terms of Michael Crichton, things like Pirate Latitudes was one of the first posthumous books that was published in November of 2009. Micah was published in 2011 and was finished by author Richard Preston. There's also Dragon Teeth, which was published in 2016, and The Andromeda Evolution, which was published in 2019, a sequel to The Andromeda Strain and finished by Daniel H. Wilson. Now, I first realized all these posthumous works were coming out of Michael Crichton's around that time, because I remember walking through the store and seeing The Andromeda Strain on the shelves. And I remember thinking to myself, isn't that guy dead? How is he publishing works? So, again, to be fair, the publishing of posthumous works is nothing out of the left field here. However, according to this book, Sherry Crichton decided James Patterson was a good choice for the fourth posthumous release, and I cannot understand why. Well, I can, but for those of you who are new to my channel, you know that I have, let's say, issues with Patterson. This well-known author has been on the New York Times bestseller list many times over. Well over 100 times, actually. Mostly because he tries to sue if he isn't put on the list. But that does give the impression that the man at least knows how to write a book, right?
Oh, for crying out loud. What's the biggest author in the world have to do to get a little privacy?
Well, in my opinion, no. Because this comes to the main issue I have with James Patterson and considering him an author. He doesn't actually write his own books. He uses ghostwriters. Or more accurately, he claims he collaborates with other authors to publish works. Now, I'll go more into why I think Patterson is a hack of a writer who isn't nearly as involved in his writing process as he wants you to believe he is, as well as why I find the idea of calling Patterson an author is very inaccurate another day. Maybe I'll make a whole video on it. But the simple fact of the matter is that Patterson once said, while defending his right to write an African-American detective, Alex Cross, that he hadn't written a single word of his books in 2001. Now, he may have meant it as an exaggerated joke, but I get the feeling that's truer than the other way around. In any case, Now that I picked up this book for this month, because when I saw that, I just had to stop and ask myself, if Crichton is dead, and Patterson is very open about the fact he uses ghostwriters to do all of the work he takes credit for, who the hell wrote this book?
Oh, thank God you found me! This monster kidnapped me and was making me write a book for him!
Maybe he had an actual ghostwriter. These are the questions that keep me up at night. Anyway, here's the report card. And so we move on to the cover. And I mean, it's okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just a volcano exploding. Accurate to what occurs in the book, but really not all that eye-catching if it wasn't for the gloss lettering on the front. Honestly, the gloss lettering kind of ruins it a little bit because it takes up so much of the book that it swallows the actual cover. Like I pointed out before when I read James Patterson books, clearly name recognition is what Patterson goes for when he writes. He makes his name as big as possible on the front, to the point that it's often bigger than the title, or even bigger than the person who actually wrote the book. Actually, it's always bigger than the person who actually wrote the book, but, you know. I mean, ironically, the other Hawaiian volcano-themed novel that I read during October had a cover for this book that I actually feel was more fitting for Eruption than itself. It's this one, for those of you who aren't aware. But let's get into what this book is actually about. Now, I'd love to read you a synopsis on the book from the back, but Patterson spends most of the cover jerking himself off rather than actually trying to get you excited about the work. The only synopsis is on the back, and it's basically 2 sentences that can be summed up with: a giant volcano is about to explode and destroy Hawaii, and the U.S. military fucked up again, making everything harder for everyone else in the process. That's it. I'm not kidding. If you wanna doubt me, pause the video right here and read it. And it is exactly what's on the back. So, and it's funny because it's not even true, because the volcano in this story isn't about to destroy Hawaii. The book waxes on about being the big one, but never is the volcano itself going to destroy the island. Rather, just the city that's nearby, Hilo. I don't actually know how to pronounce the city name, so I apologize for that. But it's supposed to destroy the city, which, don't get me wrong, would be a lot of casualties, because I'm pretty sure it's the capital of Hawaii. But it's not a world-ending, it's not this world-ending threat that is most of the book. But let me actually give you a synopsis before I start to critique the book, because that's going to take a while. And I honestly wish I could tell you that the synopsis on the back is super bare bones and there's a lot more going on in the story, but honestly, there really isn't. And now I'm going to preface this because there's a lot of Hawaiian names and I'm not very up to date on how to pronounce a lot of them. I know a fair amount of them, but not all of them. So if you hear me butcher a couple names, that's why, and I apologize for it. But anyways, here's my basic synopsis. The volcano of Mauna Loa is about to finally erupt, potentially the biggest eruption that's ever been seen out of the volcano. Initially, there's nothing to worry about, as the predicted lava flow only looks like it will hit a barely functional army base anyways. Except our main character, Action McMahonstar, soon discovers that the army's been keeping extremely hazardous waste on the island, that if the lava were to come near and shatter the protective casing around it, could not only spell devastating effects for the island, but perhaps in the entire world. They call it Black Death, and it destroys all organic material it comes into contact with. Somehow. Action McMahonstar and his team of scientists and advisors, like Angry Military Man, Romantic Interest, Second Half of the Love Triangle, Interchangeable Scientists 1 through 3, and Young Sidekick who barely justifies his existence, must face off against the rich egotistical billionaire, the bad scientist with good publicity, and the inept politician more worried about his own power and image than actually doing the best he can to save Hawaii. As you can tell from my synopsis, and the fact that I started to tab this book only to pause 10 pages in and just give up on it, I did not like this book very well. Let's get into the many reasons why. First, let's get this out of the way. This has all the standard complaints I have for James Patterson's works, bar none. If you've seen any of my other 2 James Patty reviews, or even seen my first ever Worst Books of the Year video, you'll know that a fair amount of these complaints are... You'll know what a fair amount of these complaints are. For example, the facile and bland way the characters are and the setting is given to us is about immersive as playing through a rushed video game that can't even fully render its locations. So you're effectively driving through an entire city of blurred, pixelated graphics.
Just can't make my exquisite writing that simple. Francine is naturally banal.
Thank you.
Another thing is, it's actually kind of funny because it's so obvious when Patterson is working off his own metric and when he's using Crichton's work. For example, the writing will suddenly shift into being much more technical and competent during, the scientific scenes, and it's not like that at all for the rest of the book. I've read Patterson's attempt to be scientific in the past with the Zoo, and this isn't how he does it. And I own enough Crichton works to recognize at least basically what Crichton writes like. So, in fact, it becomes painfully clear when Patterson is injecting his own things because it is so obvious that he's writing this book with the adaptation already in mind. There are several scenes in here where I can see Patterson holding up his hands and loudly declaring, Okay, I know this doesn't seem that exciting now, but can you just imagine when they use this scene in the movie? It's gonna be awesome, right?
Guy could easily turn any 2-bit detective characters into a bestseller, which would then be optioned for a movie.
The kind of movie that wouldn't get a theatrical release but would go straight to Redbox?
A Redbox exclusive!
And I swear to you, this isn't me exaggerating. The scenes that I think about most when I tell you this is when Action McMahonstar meets with Stern General. And instead of Stern General just outright telling Action McMahonstar things outright, he repeatedly avoids answering directly so he can show off the scenes. We can see the scene play out rather than just being like, hey, this is what's going to happen. It actually gets genuinely frustrating with how often Patterson abuses the cut to a new scene to finish the sentence trope. I forget what exactly it's called. Like every dramatic moment, the general just gives a wishy-washy answer or the runaround of the question until we get to the scene where he's going to show it off rather than telling Action McMahonstar what he's talking about. Here's a couple examples. And one night Mauna Kea was struck by lightning that generated an electromagnetic field so powerful it degaussed the disk and erased all the information stored there. There were no backups. The backups were unreadable too. And that's why you don't know what this material is. Well, we didn't, Briggs said. For 20 years, we had no idea. He paused and looked directly at Mac. We found out when we had an accident, Briggs said. And then, obviously, cut to the next chapter. Now, that one isn't too bad. But like this one. They went past massive air coolers with fans 6 feet in diameter, but John McGregor could still feel the heat radiating from the depths ahead. They were now walking on a metal deck covered in thick foam. On either side were stacked metal lockers, each 4 feet square and padlocked. Up ahead, a pale blue light reflected off the ceiling. McGregor said, "What is this place?" "Storage facility." "And what are you storing?" Briggs opened a heavy gate door. It creaked open. "Look." But it happens a lot more than those 2 times. The other times are just one of those, it makes you wait a lot longer, so I don't want to spend the time reading it out for you. But trust me, it happens way too often where they'll be like, it'll be like that scene they constantly make fun of, where it's like, wait till you hear this. And then it just cuts to something else when you never get to know it until it's necessary for the scene. Which works in shows and movies because it's a visual medium. It's much more, you see stuff happening on screen. Whereas with books, you are reading it. So you need to visualize things in your mind. So doing this whole... And it does work in books too, don't get me wrong. But you also can't overuse it or it loses its effect. So anyways... But if you still think I'm exaggerating about Patterson clearly writing for the adaptation first and writing the book second, how about these scenes where Patterson is literally casting people in the roles he's writing? Finally, the head of a team, a George Clooney lookalike named Morton, said, "I think we need to go outside now. All of us." Or what about... Rivers was 6 foot 6 inches tall and had the silver hair and rugged good looks of the actor Pierce Brosnan. Patterson, how about you get the book out and see if it's popular before you start casting for a movie that probably won't even get made? Alright? Listen, I know that Patterson has such an inflated ego about himself that, again, he actually sued the New York Times when his books didn't show up on their bestsellers list. Yes, I'm serious. But do me a favor, Patterson, in the future, actually pretend to write the book and worry about the adaptation second. I've read actual film novelizations better than the schlock you put in this book, and they were written as a movie first and came out later as a book. Apart from that, you just have the standard Patty tropes. Chapters that are only a max of 5 pages long at most, despite clearly needing to be longer at several points. Quick tip for writers in the future. If you end a chapter just to immediately continue the scene in the next chapter as if nothing changed, there's no scene change, no tone change, nothing, then you didn't need to start a new chapter. You honestly didn't even need a chapter break. You honestly could just keep going and it would have been fine. Patterson also has this thing where he constantly tries to be funny with his character quips or comedy, and it's just so goddamn forced and cringy. Oh my god. It is painful. Like, I brought it up in Zoo about how he would throw out random comedic moments and it would completely ruin the tone of the scene he's in, because it's a serious tone and he has a character being like, well, I don't think AA is going to respond to this car crash. Or AAA, AAA, whatever. When Mac and Ginny walked into the data room, Rick Ozaki wasn't afraid to hug him. Mac was grinning when he stepped back. Any longer and we'd be picking out furniture. Rick grinned back. Kiss my ass. And here I thought we were having a moment. Listen, I'll make this short. Or start with one of the first jokes in the book. When the children were in the cafeteria, Rachel ran to her office. She checked in with her boss and made a phone call to Ted Murray, an ex-boyfriend at Stanford who had recommended her for the job, and convinced her to take it, and who now vowed for the Army Corps of Engineer at the Military Reserve. We might have a thing here, Rachel told him. A thing? God, you scientists and your fancy words. What about... We don't have enough time for that, Rivers said. We're using your schematics, going through the areas that we think are most vulnerable and telling people they need to leave. The way they do on the main island when there's a hurricane coming. I can't disagree with that, Max said. Rivers shrugged. Martial law, he said. And I'm the marshal. Like, trying to read James Patterson's attempt to be funny in this book is so cringy. It's like, oh, like I didn't even read you the worst examples. It's just those are the ones I marked because I had to stop marking how unfunny they were. Otherwise, I would have taken most of my notes. Anyways, there are times when the characters just constantly repeat themselves and act like that's the first time they heard of the information. A lot like in Daniel X, where there was a scene where a character said something. Oh, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. Character repeats it. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. Character repeats it. Oh my god, he knows that? If I didn't think I'd actually hurt myself, I'd whack myself in the head with this staff thing. So, yeah. But, like on page 76, where Action McMahon Star is shocked to find out the exact thing that Disposable Scientist number 2 described to him, and how his research concluded that this would happen. And then Action McMahon Star does his own research and discovers, oh my god, the exact same thing that Disposable Scientist 2 told me was going to happen might happen. Shock, horror, who would have guessed? Except Disposable Scientist 2, who told you all this. Also, constant, pointless scenes. There's a little of this book dedicated to a pair of New York Times reporters who come and try to figure out what's going on. What's their relevance to the story? Absolutely nothing, considering they do nothing at all to affect the main plot or characters, and at most serve as a very minor annoyance to our main characters that ultimately just like, hey, can you tell us the truth? No. God, you guys are dicks. And leave. That is the extent of their character in this book. Oh, what about Action McMahon Star's wife leaving him and taking the twins out of state? Well, apart from some very minor character moments, no, that's not relevant either. In fact, I think I would argue and say if his children were on the island, it would have made the stakes much better and the genuine trouble he has to go through when he's making a big decision at the end make much more impact. Oh, what about when female bad scientist with good publicity suddenly realizes how crazy her husband and her sponsor, the rich egotistical billionaire, are, and watches they get a man killed with their own idiocy, with strong implications that she no longer wants to deal with him or be on their side?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Literally, we never even see her perspective again. It causes no friction between her and male bad scientists with good publicity, and she never turncoats to Action McMahon star's side. Ultimately, it just ends with a random, oh my god, maybe we are going too far. And then that's it. She just ends up being a blank character who dies with them at the end of the story anyways when the story calls for it. But of course, I guess in order for her character to have anything going on, that would require any of the characters to have any form of personality, which they don't. I'm really not being funny when I'm calling the characters Action McMahon Star or Disposable Scientist 2. It literally is just the best way to describe the characters because they are that soulless. There was one point where two of Action McMahon Star's Disposable Scientist team steal all of the research they had and turns it over to the bad scientist with good publicity. And it's supposed to be shocking. Except, I beg of you, tell me absolutely one thing about the characters Kenny and Pia that make them anything more than two names on the paper. I'm genuine. I implore anyone who has read this book and is watching this video, without looking it up or referencing the book you own, tell me one thing about either of these two characters that stood out from you, that gave them character, that made them more than just a series of letters in the form of a name. And naturally, of course, you have the incredibly predictable nature of the story. If you've seen any disaster movie in the past 10 years, you know exactly how this book is going to go. Like, I mean literally, I called every single twist throughout the book. For example, there's a love triangle in a disaster film. So obviously that means there's going to be tension for most of the book, but near the final act, the wrong half of the love triangle will suddenly end up being killed in a tragic accident, so the other two can hook up without feeling bad about it at all. But let's move on from the standard James Patterson problems and go into the more specific problems of this book. For example, the fact that it's clear that the book was started in an age where social media wasn't as big as it is now, and Patterson really doesn't try to update it beyond the standard. Yeah, you see references here and there to modern social medias. Patterson will make comments on how social media works within specific scenes, but it's clear the story was penned in 2008 and doesn't really understand how big modern social media works. For example, the book starts with a prologue set in the year of 2016, where we get a sneak peek at the dangers that really occurs when some of the government's Black Death slips out and poisons a grove of trees in Hilo's botanical garden. Despite the caretaker's protest, the army swoops in, burns down all the trees, and leaves, refusing to elaborate and somehow hiding the fact that they did that at all. Except in the age of social media, that level of ground movement with troops would not have been easily hidden, especially in a place as packed as Hawaii can be. They evacuated the botanical gardens, and the army was touching down before everyone was even gone. Even if they denied everything, someone somewhere in the world would have heard about this ground movement, and Rachel herself would have had an audience who'd listen to her, claiming that there's something more going on here, whether or not she was considered credible by the end of it. Especially because there would be evidence and collaborating stories of people who would have been at the botanical gardens who would now see the grove of trees gone. Watch as the caretaker's fired when she keeps saying, no, they didn't catch a disease, something else happened, they're not telling us, and would have seen the army deploying troops on the ground. And then suddenly, 10 years later, the army has a vested interest in a volcano eruption, refusing to allow a relatively unused base to be harmed by the lava, all while weird outbreaks of some unknown disease that just happens to match with what Rachel said happened to her trees keep occurring in the area. And it just so happens everywhere it occurs, the army shows up and quarantines the area in a very swift manner. Come on, that would be everywhere on social media, especially as the story itself considers Rachel's testimony alone to be credible enough that 2 New York Times reporters come down to try and sniff out the story. But let's go into that. I'll be honest, it is so hard to decide what makes sense for the military to be so stupid and what just feels forced for Patterson to write. Like, I can totally see the military keeping the Black Death a secret from the civilian population, because it creates pretty bad optics to know that a literal doomsday weapon is out there and the US government just kind of forgot about it until this moment and even lost all information they had on it. I get that. But then, you have it where they refuse to share the actual goal with their scientific advisors that are not Action McMahonstar's team, despite the fact that this causes serious problems within their team. Yeah, of course, egotistical rich billionaire and bad scientists with good publicity aren't taking the threat as seriously as they should. They think this is just a goal to save a barely used army base by diverting lava flow. As far as they know, there's no real danger for failure, and all of them are just here for the optics. Oh, I failed and an army base we don't even use got destroyed? That sucks, but no big loss, right? As opposed to, oh, I failed and unleashed a doomsday weapon that's going to kill all life on Earth? Call me crazy, but I think those two scenarios has different goals when put into your mind. Can you imagine how different their actions would have been if you told them, hey, if this lava hits the military base, all life on Earth will probably be wiped out in 72 hours? Maybe you wouldn't have as many people trying to dick swing at each other as opposed to just accomplishing their task. Or maybe you could at least be a little more honest with the cleanup crews, you know, the ones responsible for keeping the Black Death thing under control whenever there's a leak, instead of just telling them, oh, it's a normal radioactive waste leak. You could at least tell them something more, you know, not maybe the truth, but hey, this is an incredibly dangerous chemical weapon we're storing here, and if it gets on you, you need to have some serious decontamination protocols, or you might die. So, I don't know. You don't have people constantly sneaking off base after skipping decontamination protocols and causing outbreaks of this disease, wiping out swaths of plant lives and humans, which happens multiple times over the course of the book. Oh, and by the way, though that sounds interesting, it really isn't. Honestly, except for serving as a, this is why we need to divert the lava flow obstacle in the story, the Black Death thing doesn't matter to the overall story. It's meant to be a lingering threat, but Patterson is just so inept with how it works that it just feels like these small outbreaks are more like just padding rather than demonstrations of why it's so dangerous to let Black Plague spread. For example, a sergeant skips the decontamination protocol and sneaks out to see his girlfriend at the bar. Within hours, he's already beginning to see symptoms, and he's actively spreading the disease, forcing the army to quarantine the restaurant, and watches the sergeant dies a slow, painful death that is best equated to napalm burns. But his girlfriend escapes. Now, in the story, his girlfriend is on the run for about 4 days. Never once in the POV chapters do we actually see her suffering any of the effects of the Black Death. She doesn't describe having a fever, she doesn't describe being slightly delirious, she doesn't describe being even weak. However, despite this, she somehow infects her grandparents and their farmland with the Black Death, destroying all of them in a terrible way. And when she discovers this, despite the army literally being right behind her, and the fact she's showing no symptoms, we find out later that by the time the army got to the house, she had died from the Black Death as well. Let's go over the many ways that that makes the Black Death a very inconsistent virus and thus ruins a lot of the tension behind it. For example, for number 1, the spread of the disease and the speed in which it spreads makes no sense. It takes hours to show symptoms from the sergeant and days, close to a week, before he actually dies from the disease. However, his girlfriend's grandparents show symptoms and die in a matter of a couple of days, with their farmland being completely wiped out in the process. Which might make sense because they're an older folk, so maybe they don't last as long. However, the girlfriend doesn't show any symptoms for at least 4 days until she discovers her already dead grandparents. And then, apparently, in a matter of minutes, completely succumbs to the disease and dies before she can be apprehended by the army, who were literally right behind her. Literally, her last chapter ends with her hearing them pulling up to the grandparents' farmhouse. Furthermore, another guy who gets exposed in another scene dies within minutes of being exposed. However, 4 other people who sneak off the base die within a day of being exposed. Number 2, the infection rates make no sense. So the sergeant infecting the girlfriend makes sense. He probably touched her, they got close, particle spread, whatever. And obviously the girlfriend infecting the grandparents makes sense. But then the girlfriend was also in a crowded area surrounded by people as she tried to slip onto an evacuation ship, and yet no one else gets infected? In addition, when she infects her grandparents' grove, only the grove plants get infected and none of the plant life surrounding the place, despite the fact that there's a clear showing that her grandparents lived pretty far off from the city and were surrounded by nature. There's also the 4 people who snuck out and died in a secluded cabin in the woods. They all died in their cabin, but it doesn't describe anything about the area around them being killed. So, how exactly does this thing spread? What is the rate of its spread? From the sounds of it, you either have to be really close, but even if you are really close, it's not 100%. And it doesn't work. It doesn't instantly kill plant life, but occasionally it does. Sometimes it might take a week to kill you. Other times it'll kill you in like a couple days. Actually, I think I just had those 2 points, but I think the points are pretty encompassing, so let's just go ahead and move on. And for my final critique, it's just my final big critique, because I have a lot of tiny critiques I want to comment on, like legitimate factual errors. At one point, they say the Gulfstream Peregrine is the fastest private jet in the world, when in reality it's the Gulfstream G500, and it has been since 2016. So, yeah. But anyways, for my final big point, nothing happens in this book. Yeah, honestly, this is one of the most boring disaster medias I have ever read, and it is a new low of boring for Patterson works. Like, I'll give Zoo the credit that at least shit was happening throughout the book, and it didn't just feel like the characters were shuffling back and forth, talking and warning of the danger coming, but no actual danger is showing up. And all the danger that does happen is completely disconnected to the main plot, and thus feels more like distractions rather than a natural progression of the stakes. I gotta be honest with you, I am not even thinking about how I play with this, I'm just messing with it as I talk. So anyways, I got halfway through, and I even made a note about just how nothing was going on in this book. If this was any other author but James Patterson, I might have even DNF'd the book. Because it was Patterson, it was like reading preschool level writing, and I could blow through 60 pages in like less than 20 minutes. So it honestly didn't bother me to keep reading, because I knew I would be done really fast once I put my mind to it. But a part of this also means the theme of the story is just so out of whack. I mean, the story itself can't seem to decide if it's trying to go for a theme of the overwhelming power of nature against man's hubris and thinking he can control it, or actually falling into the camp that man can control nature and that nature is a deadly foe that we must conquer in order to live properly. Now, to give some credit, I do believe that this is rather a case of Patterson and Crichton's intention duking it out over the course of the book. For those of you who are unaware, Crichton was not exactly a believer in man-made climate change, and believed it was entirely natural for what was occurring. Now, considering he died in 2008, I would like to think he would have changed his mind upon seeing the overwhelming number of studies that say this isn't the case over the course of the last 16 years, since he's been dead, and would have admitted that perhaps he was wrong. I mean, even Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, changed their tune in the belief of climate change. For those of you who don't know, the man-bear-pig thing that Al Gore constantly talks about, it was supposed to be an allegory to climate change. So,
there's no scientific proof, no real evidence of a man-bear-pig.
Well, there's a lot of smart people saying man-bear-pig is real.
Yeah, and a lot of smarter people saying it isn't, okay?
But the problem is, it feels like instead of Patterson sitting down and either running with Crichton's theme and just accepting it, or trying to rework the story to a more modern interpretation, Patterson tried to do this half and half thing, where he's saying both and neither at the same time, which ultimately leaves the whole thing feeling confused and boring. So, in the end, I'm going to give this book a very pitiful 3 out of 10. Look, I'll be honest with you guys. I don't know if I actually hated this book that much, or it was just me getting more and more frustrated with how bad Patterson's writing is. I'm sure I'm not the only person who gets a little frustrated as an aspiring author who wants to put out the best work they can, and they see people like Patterson going out there with, like, barely putting in an effort into his works and making millions and millions of dollars off of very worthless works. I have genuinely read self-published works on Amazon that are far better than any James Patterson work I've read so far. That being said, on its own merits, it's really still not a good book. I'm not even sure I can really recommend this book in a popcorn flick kind of way. In a so bad it's kind of fun. And honestly, it's just a very boring book. It's annoying. I don't want to spread, hey, let's buy this book and make fun of it, because it really doesn't deserve that even. It doesn't feel like Patterson cares about his writing. He just cares about the money he's gonna make by writing something. If I had, honestly, I'm even cynical enough to think that Sherry Crichton only chose Patterson because she knew he would get the book to sell even if it wasn't good. Because I don't know how well the other posthumous releases did. But that being said, it's just kind of one of those, I don't recommend this book, and when it comes to the question of, does it deserve Mount Doom? The answer is obviously yes. Like, that book is awful, and I really don't recommend it to anyone. It's not a good Crichton book. It's just a standard, very bad Patterson book. And, maybe it's my own bias flowing through. Maybe it is more of a 4 out of 10 than a 3 out of 10. But it is seriously not good, guys. The characters are inconsistent, and that's when they have character at all, and not just, here's a single trait about them, now remember them forever. Or when it's clear that Patterson is just writing because he wants to sell this book as a movie. Or, the story not making any sense, the characters constantly repeating, the constant padding throughout the book. It's just not good. It really isn't, and I don't recommend it. So, that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having. Even the bad ones. But maybe if it's written by a dead person, don't pick it up, because I have not heard of one good book released posthumously that has actually been up to... Okay, maybe the Tolkien works. Maybe the Tolkien works. Unless it's Tolkien, don't read books posthumously. Or if it's worth it. You know what? Whatever. Just don't read this book. That's what I'm getting at.